Hello, I want to welcome you to this lecture on developing intercultural sensitivity. As we look at developing intercultural sensitivity, we look at it from two mindsets, a mindset and a skill set, two different really philosophies, I guess. And under mindset, we look at no behavior exists separately from thought and emotion. And as a skill set, we see that it includes the ability to analyze interaction, predict misunderstanding, and fashion adaptive behavior. So as we think of intercultural sensitivity and developing that, if we have a mindset, it's going to affect even like predisposition us to a certain way, whereas a skill set will allow us an ability to analyze and interact and fashion adaptive behavior. So we can actually develop an intercultural sensitivity skill set rather than going by a mindset that is develops into prejudices and racism and stereotypes and that sort of thing. Secondly, we see that the mindset refers to one's awareness of operating in a cultural context. And a skill set, in contrast, can be thought of as the expanded repertoire of behavior, which includes behavior appropriate to one's own culture, but that does not thereby exclude alternative behavior that might be more appropriate in another culture. And then thirdly, the mindset includes the maintenance of attitudes such as motivators for seeking out cultural differences. And so really just kind of maintaining that stronghold on why people do certain things, a mindset saying, oh, they do it, and it's all based off of the person who is coming up with the ideas from their predisposition mindset. So they're filling in the reasons why, giving the reasons why. Where in a skill set, knowledge, attitude, and behavior must work together for development to occur. So more of a learner attitude, more sitting back and waiting and seeing why things are done the way they are, rather than predispositioned to judgment. We can also look at culture from an objective view as well as a subjective view of culture. Under objective culture, it refers to the institutional aspects of culture. Here, the idea of things like political and economic systems, and to products of culture, art, music, those types of things. Where in a subjective culture, it really refers more to the experiences of the social reality formed by a society's institutions. In other words, the worldview of society's people. So you're really looking at more subjective, more fluid, dynamic things that are changing, adapting, rather than an objective cultural view, looking at things that a culture is kind of governed by in their political situation, their social structure, those sorts of things, and how laws are enacted and that sort of thing. Another area is objective culture, though it is good for understanding the cultural creations of other groups, but it's not necessarily very useful in the workplace and working with diverse groups. You can understand and know, okay, I understand knowledge-wise that's what it is, but in a subjective understanding of culture, it's the key to comprehending the juncture between global and domestic diversity, so thereby being able to see and gain an appreciation of diverse cultures, and thereby not trying to fit everybody into a certain mold, but allowing there to be diversity and differing opinions and different views on looking at things. Thirdly, objective culture is internalized through socialization. And so that's something that somebody possesses and has with them, part of how they grew up, their cultural space, talking another lecture coming up, and the context for them. For subjective culture, it allows us to respect the equal complexity and potential usefulness of each of our perspectives. So thereby allowing it to be more, once again, just accepting more, I guess, of a postmodern view of culture than, it's black and white, it's no shades of gray, it's linear, it's all, outline form, it's modern, it's, this is the way it is, rather than, the newer view of allowing there to be, different viewpoints, different perspectives, and allowing people to have those viewpoints rather than saying, well, it's wrong or it's stupid because it's not the way I think or the way I was brought up. My cultural space defines it. It allows for differing views and acceptance of those views. Diversity. Diversity is defined as cultural differences in values, beliefs, and behaviors learned and shared by groups of interacting people defined by nationality, ethnicity, gender, age, physical status, education, profession, religion, organizational affiliation, and any other grouping that generates identifiable patterns. On this slide here, we'll look at the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. First, we'll look at the ethnocentric stages, and then we'll move over to the ethno-relative stages. In the ethnocentric stages means that one's own culture is experienced as central to reality in some way, so sort of the center of the universe. First stage in ethnocentric stages, coming to intercultural sensitivity, is denial, where one's own culture is experienced as the only real one, and consideration of other cultures is avoided by maintaining psychological or physical isolation from differences. Then moves into the defense stage, where one's own culture or an adopted culture is experienced as the only good one, and cultural differences are denigrated. Then into the minimization stage. This is where elements of one's own cultural worldview are experienced as universal, so that despite acceptable surface differences with other cultures, essentially those cultures are similar to one's own. Then as you look at the ethno-relative stages, this means that one's own culture is experienced in the context of other cultures. So here we see acceptance. With acceptance, other cultures are included in experience as equally complex but different constructions of reality. Then the adaptation stage, one attains the ability to shift perspective in and out of another cultural worldview. Thus, one's own experiences includes the different culture experiences of someone in another culture. And then into integration, or even assimilation. One's experiences of self is expanded to include movement in and out of different cultural worldviews. Here we look at race and culture. Race is typically defined in terms of physical characteristics such as skin, color, facial features, hair type, which are common to an inbred, geographically isolated people. Whereas culture, two of the most challenging issues in diversity work are overcoming the idea that race is culture and overcoming racism itself. And on this next slide, I have a short video by one of my colleagues, Dr. Wesley Waller. It's very entertaining, as you'll see. But it's on Schema and looking at Piaget's developmental stages for children as they grow up and they develop their schemas advance as they get older. And I want you to view this from the viewpoint of racism and intercultural sensitivity, and understanding how when we demonstrate racism or prejudice, intercultural insensitivity, it's really the sign or an indicator of an underdeveloped schema when it comes to intercultural diversity. And so I think you're going to enjoy this next clip, and so we'll come back and then wrap it up after you watch that video.
Well, hello, my friends. We are going to talk about the transition of a schema as one moves through life. And as you noted in some of our last lectures, a schema is nothing really but a cognitive filing cabinet by which someone may choose to classify interaction with their environment. In this particular case, we again have little Rusty, and here he is in his diaper, and he has the most important thing in life, schema. And this little schema, it has his most important thing, which in this particular case is a bottle. Now, do you think that as little Rusty goes through life, that his most important thing, schema, is still going to be classified and have a bottle in it? I don't really think so. Here we have young Rusty. And the most important thing that this little nerd has is this good looking blonde that is in that. I fondly remember those days. I don't know if you ever heard the story about the old preacher that stood up and he told his congregation, I'm going to shout out a word. And when I do, you stand up and call out the song that comes to mind. And he said salvation, and somebody stood up and said amazing grace. And he talked about service, and somebody stood up and said, let's sing only trust him. And then he cried out the word sex, and an old woman stood up and said precious memories. Okay, that's enough said with that, but it's really kind of cute, isn't it? Look at the transition in these two schemata. The first schema, most important when we have little Rusty, is this bottle. He lives for that bottle. And then here we have young Rusty, and of course he's interested in the opposite gender. Now let's move on to middle Rusty. Man, he likes that fast race car, doesn't he? I hate to tell you, I don't know. I couldn't figure out whether I'm in this one right here or in the next one. I certainly can be seen with that cup of coffee. And then we get to old Rusty, and what do you think that is up there? That, my friends, is a warm bedpan. Now, what Piaget observed is that as people go through life, schema undergo transitions. And it's not necessarily that one schema, the schema earlier one just vanishes. It is that it grows and it's enriched by the experiences of life. Now, it's very interesting here. Schema go through transitions, but so does an individual as they go through life in the manner in which they think. What Piaget really accomplished with this is that he said and indicates for us, or taught, implied, and I may be paraphrasing him, but that children are not just little adults. Children think differently than adults. Children are going through stages of interacting with their world, and the schemata which they develop become more and more complex, and the complexity of these schemata and the transition of these schemata mean that a person goes through stages naturally, stages of development. So in our next little exciting discussion, we're going to look at some of the stages that Piaget identified. And in this course, each of those stages will soon be a major module of study which we will examine in detail. I might ought to let all of you vote as to where I am in this scale, but I sure do like warm bedpans.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little presentation. And so, as you can see, I mean, it would be very sad if we saw an adult walking around calling horses and cows and sheep still calling them dogs. And a lot of times, that's what we do with racism. Or most times, is it's a really an underdeveloped schema where we lump everybody into one group from a particular race or culture. And we see how stereotypes and generalizations come about. Stereotype is the practice of treating each person as an individual, is often a pitfall of diversity programs, as it imposes the Western idea of individualism in every instance. And we know that other cultures, especially in the East, view things more holistically rather than individualistic. Also, it's in generalizations very close to stereotypes for trying to define the differences, but it's generally more beneficial to use accurate cultural generalizations, not to be confused with stereotypes. So, generally speaking about a culture, this culture tends to do things this way. Asian culture is more holistic rather than saying an Asian culture in a derogatory stereotype idea, or of certain folks in the Middle East, certain populations there being more in a tribal with a leader group and a leader of a group than again referring to that in a derogatory term. And so these generalizations obviously refer to the tendencies, the predominant tendencies among cultural groups, and we can tell by quantifiable research as well, how that they have adapted and how, not to their situation and their living conditions, things that they way they farm possibly, or what they do for cultivating their crops, or for harvesting animals and hunting and gathering, how they, house construction, all those things that have adapted to the cultural and the climate and environment in which they find themselves. But another thing that is key to this understanding too is that, remember that these are generalizations and tendencies, and not that everybody fits into the same mold. And so we can look at these generalizations are best applied in tentative hypotheses and really are subject to verification. But just remember once again about racism, it really is an indicator of an underdeveloped cultural diversity schema. And so I hope you enjoyed this presentation and look forward to seeing you in the next one.